Hi everyone, my name is Eduardo. You can just call me Edu, and I'm bringing you something quite different from what I usually have on my channel. It's actually a kind of perspective or opinion on Dynamax and VGC. I'll call it Dynamax and VGC, why it is bad and should feel bad. So let's get straight into it. We'll start off with a small introduction. So yeah, basically Dynamax is the new mechanic that uh, doubles the Pokemon's HP for 3 turns and changes its normal moves to their max forms or Gigantamax forms, depending if they're regular Dynamax or Gigantamax. Basically, every generation of Pokemon we've had some sort of overwhelming source of damage. It's what Pokemon is. It's got to have some way to not make the games boring. Uh, we've had self-destruct and explosion, having the opponent's defenses in the past. We had gems, which in Generation 5 were absurd. I mean, by themselves they weren't that bad, but with Draco Meteor, they got stupidly strong. It's basically a choice item, but you can switch around moves. Yeah, Draco Meteor was way too strong, especially given that fairy types were not a thing back then, and basically only steel type resisted it, so no immunities. It's just really hard to deal with. But then again, just a very strong source of damage. Always had that in Pokemon. Then came the Mega Evolutions. Saw a little bit of that, and they basically just gave stronger versions of Pokemon that already existed, with some very interesting abilities, signature abilities on some of them. And not gonna lie, at first when they were first introduced, especially like Pokemon like Mega Kangaskhan, felt really strong and hard to deal with, as they were meant to actually be pretty strong. So they were kind of a change of pace there. They didn't feel like absolutely broken in my opinion, but that's subjective. Then we had the Z moves, which were actually very similar to Gems in a sense, except that basically you could burn them in a sense. You could like basically use the move into an immunity or protect, and you're kind of wasting it. Whereas Gems didn't have that option. But on the other hand, sometimes they could get even stronger. So it depends, really. But anyway, now we have a new mechanic that does not require you to hold an item. Now that's a very interesting change, because Gems, Mega Evolution, Z moves, they all had that part of it. But now you don't have to hold an item, which is definitely extremely interesting and will definitely come into play later into the video. So basically that's the introduction, and now I want to get into a very important topic in my opinion, which is the impact on game depth. What does that mean? Basically every game has sort of depth. You'll see rock paper scissors does have some sort of depth from the psychological standpoint, but there are many options, many possible outcomes. So it's just the very bottom of depth in a game, I believe. Whereas Pokemon, you'll see, especially in VGC, you'll have like your left Pokemon can target their left Pokemon or their right Pokemon with each one of those moves, each one of the 4 moves, and then you can even target the partner or even itself, depending if it's like something like Recover. Then it has the option to switch out into Pokemon A or Pokemon B. There's so many options to cover that it really makes the game very deep. Now, Dynamax, before it happens, before any Pokemon has Dynamaxed, it heavily increases the amount of options or different outcomes. As you have to keep in mind that any Pokemon on the field can Dynamax, and essentially every move that it carries has basically twice the possible outcomes, as it can go for the regular move or the Dynamax version, and then your moves towards that Pokemon will do half of what it usually would have done. So those are very important to keep in mind. It definitely increases the amount of outcomes there are before Dynamax. However, after Dynamax, or while Dynamax is going on at least, it actually could be argued that it reduces, because, for example, Pokemon like Conkeldurr, right? It has Drain Punch and Mach Punch. You lose the basic Mach Punch is useless when you Dynamax Conkeldurr. It's basically a weaker version of Drain Punch, no point in using it. So the amount of moves you have available is actually smaller. You also can target yourself. By yourself, I mean your ally, and it kind of reduces the amount of options there. But that's only for about 2 turns. You can also switch out. There will be way less scenarios where switching out is viable or profitable in any way. But just kind of reduces the amount of possible outcomes or depth in those 2 turns. Regardless, you still have to keep in mind that every time a max move is used, a boost is given, and if you switch out, the potential of the boost changes dramatically, depending on the boost, of course. Because if it's an attack boost into a special attacker, you're not getting much, but if you switch that special attacker to a physical attacker, you'll be gaining a lot from the max knuckle. So, very important to keep that in mind. It does kind of increase depth in that sense, I guess, but in general, I'd say it reduces for those 2 turns. Obviously, not including the first turn, because that turn, you still have to, the opponent still has to cover, still doesn't know that you're gonna Dynamax, so still has to cover for the potential of it not happening. This kind of perspective is very important to make a parallel with surprise factor, kind of like an extra that I want to just add, like a side note. But basically, surprise factor increases the amount of moves your opponent can use, because you don't know what their 4 moves are, right? So basically, when you're playing without knowing the sets, there's a lot more to consider, and in a sense that can increase the depth, but it can create a problem, which is what I'm about to explain. Now, if you see this image on your screen, this basically is a representation of kind of like a graph that shows where you have 0 possible outcomes, which is the baseline. Then you have infinite amount of possible outcomes. Somewhere in between that, there's a blurred line. That blurred line represents the point at which there's way too many outcomes for it to be expectable for the game to be competitive, right? Because it gets to a point where you just can't cover everything. Well, maybe competitive is not a very good word, but what I'm trying to get to is that it might get to a point where trying to cover for one option will directly conflict with the other option, and it can get to a point where it kind of contradicts the whole concept of odd management that basically this game is. So yeah, just wanted to kind of give you this concept, this idea of the blurred line, in which the game just becomes too hard or too deep to be able to play. So depth is fine. Depth is great even. It makes the game more interesting, more challenging, but it can get to a point where it's just too much, and it's not even humanly possible to be able to get that far. So yeah, that's something I want to mention. Not sure how, I guess it's still subjective on what you can take off of this information, but something that I feel like is important to take into consideration. Next, I want to introduce the concept of beating Dynamax. Of course, you kind of want to beat it, of course. So, there are a few ways you can do that. Damage control is very important. Your opponent is stuck on the field for those 3 turns, basically. They can switch out, but they lose their Dynamax. It's very important to say that those 3 turns, something that Dynamax definitely added that other mechanics didn't really, was that the game kind of becomes very centered around Dynamax. The moves are so good that it's basically a game to see who Dynamax is better, who gets the most out of Dynamax. It's not necessarily that simple. Sometimes you can get a ton of KOs with Dynamax and still lose. It's still Pokemon. There's still a lot on the line, but it still feels like the player that gets the most out of Dynamax wins the game, most of the time at least. So it's important to make sure those 3 turns are the best possible. That being said, how can you stop your opponent from having a good Dynamax? Damage control is a very important one because you reduce the opponent's stats or increase yours. By doing that, you basically mitigate the boost they get. If you drop their attack, for example, you can make them do way less damage. If you boost your defense, you'll be able to take their hits better. So that they won't make that big of a difference compared to what it usually would have done if you hadn't played so defensively. And that brings up the concept of defensive Dynamax. There are many ways that you can use your Dynamax. You can go for just straight up trying to get as much offense in the beginning, to a point where your opponent will not be able to recover. Or you can just do some damage control and later on abuse your opponent's lack of Dynamax or the extra bulk to really punch through. The other option is the defensive Dynamax, where you Dynamax yourself to prevent the opponent from running through you. Now, this doesn't feel as effective in doubles in the sense that they can just target the partner, but at the same time they can just ignore your Dynamax, right? So it's very interesting dynamic there, but I think defensive Dynamax is very interesting too, especially because you have to keep in mind that you've got Steel Spike and Quake, both of which boost defenses. You've got Wormwind and you've got Flutterby, which reduce the opponent's attack and special attack. So all of those are very important to keep in mind. If you want to go for defensive Dynamax, you're basically not only boosting your HP, you can also reduce their stats. So you can do both at the same time. Now, something I want to keep in mind, I want to add to the video is that it's very important to understand that when you Dynamax 1v1, you actually make the game bulkier. Moves aren't boosted, depending on the moves, but they're boosted only by 1.5, not even that, a bit less than 1.5. Whereas your bulk is boosted by 2. That basically means that the damage you're taking damage better. The boost to bulk is bigger than the boost to offense. So in general, Dynamax ends up being pretty defensive if you think about it. But at the same time, it's doubles. There are the boosts and all that to consider, so it's not that simple. But that goes to show that Dynamaxing can be used defensively and is a very solid way to stop the opponent from winning the Dynamax war. The other option is sleep. Now, this is where it gets very dicey. So basically, sleep nullifies Dynamax for up to 3 turns if you get lucky, or just 1 turn, which by itself is already pretty good. If the goal is to get as much from Dynamax as possible, if you get just 1 turn without any moves, it's gonna be hard to win that sort of war. But that brings up a problem, because not only do most sleep moves have low accuracy, like Sleep Powder, Hypnosis, even Sing, you also have another problem, which is if you fall asleep, it's completely luck based whether or not you wake up. And that sleep being so good at stopping Dynamax brings up a luck factor that doesn't feel healthy, and that's where things kind of start going south. The way it promotes sleep, it's pretty insane. In previous generations, if you slept a Z move mon, right? They stay asleep. It's bad that you can't use your Z move, but when you wake up, you can just use it. You still have that mechanic, and the game isn't even revolved around Z moves. With Dynamax, since the games they're coming down to how Dynamax is used, it's just, not only is it really important whether you get 1 or 3 turns or even 2 turns, it just becomes such a luck-based fest that it gets pretty annoying, and I think it kind of reduces the competitiveness of the format. That's just, I don't know, kind of my opinion, I guess. There are other things that it removes. Obviously, you can't be flinched by Rock Slide, Iron Head, and all that, so it kind of helps there. But at the same time, you're still gonna, make sleep so important that it's just kind of makes up for all that benefit, in my opinion at least. But yeah, that's definitely a problem. So now I want to get more into another topic, which is items. Now, I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it. I still believe that items are what really drive Dynamax to a pretty absurd point, and where it makes really the Dynamax so important to be, or so fundamental for you to use your Dynamax as well as possible. Let's look at some examples. So we got Life Orb. you know, kind of like one of the benefits of max moves compared to Z moves that they do less damage. It's a fact. Z moves are stronger. But now with Life Orb, like you couldn't hold an item with Z moves. You know, it's just that. It's a lot of damage, but it's just that. With max moves, it's lower, but with Life Orb, you basically get to that much damage anyway. And 3 times. And you get the bulk. And you get the side effects. So now it's a Z move, but better. You also don't even get that much punishment because your recoil is only by 5% total by the end of the Dynamax. Since the way it works, basically you take 10% from your HP, but when you Dynamax, 10% the 10% of your total HP before Dynamax is the equivalent to 5% at 200 when you have twice your HP. So, and then you go back to the HP, to the half of the HP you have when you are Dynamax. So basically, it effectively takes only 5% recoil. If you take 3 turns of Life Orb damage, when Dynamax is over, you'll only have lost 15% of your HP. So it kind of like ruins the whole balancing aspect of Life Orb, where you're supposed to get the boost, but you also lose some HP. And now it's not even that much HP, and the boost makes so much of a difference that's pretty insane. It's not necessarily that like the 5% difference between 5 and 10 is that big, but it's more that the boost is pretty insane. It gets to a point where Pokemon like Durant or Charizard are completely absurd. They're just so strong that it's just pretty insane. One of the arguments people make for max moves being better than Z moves are that they're weaker, but with Life Orb they aren't. So definitely something to keep in mind. Next item I have is the weakness policy. So this is another very problematic item. It's an easy boost to strong moves. Like the moves are already strong, and now you're just boosting yourself very easily. Because why is it easy? Because even though you're weak to it, you're at 200% HP. So basically, you're neutral. It's the same as you're gonna take the same damage as the neutral hit when you're not Dynamax. It's exactly the same thing. And it kind of ruins the trade-off of the design of the item. Basically, you're supposed to get a boost. Sure, it's really nice, but you have to take a super effective hit. With that's still gonna do a lot. So that's the trade-off. That's how it balances out. With Dynamax, you're not taking that much damage at all. You're basically being boosted by neutral hit. It just doesn't feel like the balancing that was made in the item's design is there anymore. And you can see how bad that becomes when like you can just use a very weak move to proc the weakness policy, and without much setup, you're just doing twice the damage you normally would do with already strong moves. And that was something you couldn't really do with Z moves unless you set up yourself, which you can do with max moves, of course. You can Swords Dance and then attack. But this one doesn't even require your Maxmon to be in danger for a turn. It's the other support Pokemon that procs the weakness policy, or sometimes not even that. Sometimes you can use, with Pokemon like Excadrill, you can just Dynamax, use your max moves, Steel and Ground, which are Excadrill's types, boost both defenses, and then if they want to target you, they won't KO you because you're 200% HP, and you have added bulk from the max moves. So if they want to really chunk you, they need to use super effective moves. They won't chunk you anyway because you have the bulk, so you get the boosts, and it just does too much damage. It's very easy to just proc it with an ally, and it does so much damage that it feels very overwhelming. It also creates kind of an issue with surprise factor, because you can just randomly be surprised by weakness policy, and it's really hard to cover, because for example like Dragapult with a weakness, or Togekiss even with a weakness policy, or a Babiri Berry, very different Pokemon. You kind of want to use super effective, hard hitting super effective moves like electric type on a Babiri Togekiss to get rid of it. Same thing with Scopeland's Togekiss. You want to for example, Dynamax your Rotom and win the 1v1 there if you want to beat a Togekiss. But if they're weakness policy, you used an electric move, you proc the weakness policy, and now they're gonna blow you back. So the way you play one item is very different from the way you play the other. You want to make sure the Scopeland's Togekiss doesn't get as many hits off as it wants. But if you do that, you proc that weakness policy. Same with Dragapult, for example. Life Orb takes a lot of does a lot of damage, so you might want to use your super effective move, but surprise surprise, it's easy to take the super effective move, and now it's got a boost. It's gonna run through you because it's fast and you can't really revenge KO it. So yeah, it gets pretty insane, and again, the fact that you can run Dynamax and an item making it a problem. And as I already mentioned, Togekiss, perfect follow-up would be to show you Scope Lens Razor Claw. This is another big problem, although it only is usable by Togekiss and perhaps Pheasant, I suppose, but it's really only Togekiss that can really abuse this. Thanks to this ability Super Lock, it increases the chance for critical hits by one stage, and if you give it a Scope Lens or Razor Claw, basically every single move, regardless of their, even if they don't have a high crit ratio, they'll just be at least 50% chance to crit. If they have high crit ratio, it's 100%, but there's not really much that Togekiss gets that can abuse that. But basically you can Dynamax, and all your max moves will have 50% chance of doing 50% more damage. That's pretty insane because, as I said before, damage control is very important. One of the ways that you can stop them from doing as much damage as possible is by reducing their offensive potential, either by boosting their defenses or reducing their attacks. That is kind of disregarded with Critikiss, because, you know, critical hits completely ignore stat changes. So 50% of the time, you will not be able to shut down the potential of max moves through damage control, and that's pretty insane. Completely shuts down one of the kind of balanced ways to deal with it with Dynamax, and that feels very uncompetitive. And of course, there's the fact that you're boosting the power of your moves by 50%. Without even needing to set up. That's how insane it is. Now, like, you can see that like choice items are gone when you Dynamax, and that's very important because 50% is a lot to be boosting. But Razor Claw and Scope Lens just completely bypass that, and that feels pretty absurd. And it's a lot of damage coming from Togekiss is pretty strong too, and it's bulky. It has an amazing max move in max Airstream, so it has so much going for it. It just feels like too much. So yeah, to finish it all off, I want to say that basically, you might have not noticed, or you might have, but the background I had for this presentation was balanced, and this mechanic doesn't feel balanced. Leaning towards, the balance leaning towards the negatives related to the items. I kind of decided to put the Beating Dynamax bubble in the middle. As you know, it's kind of like it has aspects that are positive, aspects that are negative, and it gives us a perfect follow-up to some of the problems I find in Dynamax. So to sum it all up, basically, my issue with Dynamax is that it's not necessarily that it's centralized, because centralizing is not that bad. Like in chess, for example, if you lose your king, it's game over. It's very similar to how in Pokemon, if you don't use your Dynamax well, you lose the game. It's like the game is focused on one point, and that's not necessarily bad. It's just that it gets to a point where it's really hard to make your opponent benefit less from Dynamax than you do, since damage control options are not effective when items are in the game. Maybe reducing attack on a Durant might be really good, but if they have a Life Orb and Hustle on top of it, they're just gonna do so much damage regardless that it doesn't even matter. Weakness policy too, you intimidated him, but he's still +1, he's still doing 50% more damage. Scope Lens, he's just critting through it, doesn't even mind it. And the one process that kind of ignores all of those changes, or all of those factors, is Sleep, which by itself is extremely luck-based, and is something that I want you to keep in mind. So yeah, these are my thoughts on Dynamax. I hope I didn't forget anything. There might have been something I might have forgotten, but it's been a long time coming for me to make this video, so I'm glad to have done it. If you have any suggestions, anything you want to tell me, please do. This is it, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for your time, and see you on my next video. Bye bye.